What if the most feared executioner of the medieval world never touched a blade, never raised her voice, and never once stepped onto a battlefield, yet kings, generals, and entire courts trembled at the sound of her footsteps? That question haunted diplomats for centuries, because the woman they called the Lady of Death did not kill to end life. She killed to erase identities, to unmake people from the inside out, and to turn high-value prisoners into warnings carved into the memory of empires. And the most disturbing part is that none of her methods were recorded in official chronicles. They survived only in fragments, whispered testimonies, and reports that rulers tried to burn out of existence. Her arrival was never announced. She did not travel with armies or appear during sieges. She appeared after victory, when resistance was broken, when prisoners still believed negotiations were possible. She walked through camps and dungeons like a quiet storm, choosing her targets with a calmness that terrified even seasoned commanders. Some said she could read fear the way a priest reads scripture. Others swore she had studied under assassins from distant kingdoms. But the truth buried beneath layers of political silence, is that she was a psychological weapon crafted by a kingdom that understood something most empires ignored. Break a man's body, and he becomes a martyr. Break his mind, and he becomes a lesson. High-value prisoners feared her not because she tortured them, but because she understood what they loved, what they regretted, what they tried to hide behind armor and rank. She used stories, symbols, and shadows instead of blades. She exposed secrets they never confessed to anyone. There are accounts of generals collapsing before she even touched them, as if she had reached inside and pulled out the one memory they could not bear to face. The Lady of Death didn't simply inflict pain. She weaponized identity, guilt, loyalty, and the terror of losing oneself piece by piece. Those who survived her presence returned to their kingdoms speaking in fragments, waking in the night screaming, begging for forgiveness for crimes they never committed. Entire alliances collapsed because a single prisoner, reshaped by her methods, returned home unable to function. And despite all this, no one ever described her face. Not once. It was as if fear itself had erased her features, leaving only a silhouette that followed prisoners into their dreams. If any. Part of this is already forcing you to rethink what real medieval power looked like. Tell me in the comments. Your insight helps shape how deep we go into these forgotten histories. And before we continue unraveling the truth behind the Lady of Death, make sure to like the video and check if you're subscribed, because what you are about to discover might surprise you more than you expect. This story is only beginning to open, and the deeper we go, the darker the shadows become, drawing us toward the next revelation that waits just ahead. She did not emerge from nobility, nor from any lineage associated with traditional power. The earliest traces of the woman who would become the Lady of Death appear in scattered border records, describing a young girl found alone after a raid, silent and strangely composed amid ruins still smoldering. Chroniclers later claimed she possessed an unsettling ability even as a child. She absorbed details others overlooked, noticing patterns in behavior, fear, and hesitation long before she understood the machinery of war. What happened between that moment and her rise to influence remains intentionally obscured, but fragments point to her being taken in by a covert order operating on the fringes of imperial authority, a group tasked with studying the deeper layers of compliance and loyalty within newly conquered territories. This organization valued intelligence not measured by swords or strategy, but by understanding what makes a ruler lose sleep and what makes a soldier betray an oath. They believed that empires do not collapse from external force. They collapse from fractures within. The girl quickly distinguished herself as someone capable of reading these fractures the way others read maps. She knew how leaders justified cruelty, how fear spreads through an army like wildfire, and how a whisper can accomplish what 1,000 troops cannot. It was not long before she became their most compelling experiment, a living embodiment of psychological pressure, sharpened slowly and deliberately. With age, she learned to use silence as a weapon. She understood the power of an unfinished sentence, the weight carried by a pause, the ruin that comes from making a man believe his deepest secret has been exposed. The Empire recognized her potential long before she had any official role. Instead of placing her in positions of authority, they kept her hidden, unseen, allowing rumors to evolve freely. A legend, after all, bends reality more effectively than any decree. By the time she was assigned her first high-value prisoner, her reputation had already traveled farther than her footsteps. What made her terrifying was not brutality, but precision. She did not rely on physical domination, nor did she revel in suffering. Instead, she isolated the one fear that governed each captive's identity. For some, it was the terror of disappointing their ancestors. For others, the shame of a betrayal long buried. She learned their histories, their alliances, their spiritual beliefs, using each detail like a thread she could pull until their sense of self unraveled. As word of her methods spread, prisoners began breaking long before she entered the chamber. Entire negotiations were influenced not by her actions, but by anticipation alone, reshaping diplomacy and war in ways generals never fully understood. Her transformation into a psychological weapon was not accidental. It was strategic, measured, and engineered by a system that understood the value of unseen power. And as her influence grew, the Empire discovered something unexpected, something they had not predicted when they forged her into their secret instrument. It was not only the prisoners who feared her. Soon, whispers began circulating within the imperial court itself, unsettling questions about whether a weapon so finely tuned to human weakness could ever be controlled, or whether the shadows they created had already begun to turn back toward them, waiting for the moment when fear would shift its direction and expose the Empire's own fractures from within. The first prisoners assigned to her were not ordinary captives. They were men and women whose decisions shaped battles, treaties, and empires. Generals who had commanded thousands, ambassadors with secretive orders, and nobles whose consent could determine the fate of entire regions. Each arrived with confidence, shields polished, eyes sharp, convinced that rank and history would protect them. But the Lady of Death had no respect for rank. She had no interest in glory. Her weapons were subtler, far more effective: anticipation, isolation, and the meticulous unraveling of certainty. She began by stripping away familiar patterns. Guards were present, but they moved unpredictably. Messages arrived, but they contradicted each other. The prisoners' schedules were manipulated, their hours of sleep shortened, meals withheld or delivered inconsistently. The world became untrustworthy, the walls themselves conspirators. Every decision, every word spoken aloud, every glance exchanged with a fellow prisoner became a risk. Slowly, certainty began to crack. Where once they had relied on their training, on alliances, and on the implicit rules of captivity, they now saw nothing solid, only shadows that shifted with every heartbeat. Observation was her first tool. She would watch from hidden vantage points as prisoners spoke to each other, noting patterns of pride, fear, and hesitation. Then she would intervene in ways that seemed trivial but carried immense psychological weight. A whispered rumor, a misplaced token, a personal item appearing mysteriously altered. Each act was calculated to make the prisoner question their memory, their judgment, their sanity. They learned to anticipate terror, only to discover it was never what they expected. The anticipation became the weapon itself, sharper than any sword. The next stage was manipulation of perception. The Lady of Death would stage encounters that blurred the lines between allies and enemies. Guards might offer a kind word, then betray a secret. Fellow prisoners might appear supportive, only to be revealed as spies. Nothing was consistent. Trust became a liability. The most courageous generals found themselves pausing before every move, doubting every strategy. Fear was no longer external. It had seeped inside them, a constant, gnawing presence that eroded decisiveness, morale, and identity. By the time she spoke, even the strongest minds were prepared to bend. Communication was her final instrument. She rarely needed to raise her voice, yet when she did, it was surgical. A single phrase, laden with meaning only the prisoner could understand, could undo years of training, years of command, years of strategy. She knew exactly what words would ignite memories they wished to forget, stir guilt they thought buried, or awaken desires and weaknesses carefully concealed. And the reactions were predictable, almost mechanical. Generals who had never faltered in battle would break in silence, surrendering not to chains, but to an invisible architecture of manipulation. Entire political decisions shifted under her influence, not through threats of death, but through the dismantling of willpower. By the end of her first year, word had spread among the corridors of power. Kings and sultans whispered of the woman who could render the most loyal advisors useless, the generals who once commanded armies now trembling in anticipation of her presence. Her name alone became a deterrent. No prison bars, no guards, no physical constraints were needed. The empire had forged a weapon more precise than any sword, more pervasive than any army, and it was human, yet far beyond human understanding. She had turned fear into an instrument of policy, and through her methods, she was quietly reshaping the balance of power across the lands, proving that the mind could be conquered before the body ever saw a blade. The Lady of Death did not need ceremonies adorned with pomp or pageantry. Her rituals were woven into silence, shadows, and the subtlest distortions of reality. Each prisoner brought into her presence became part of a system designed to disorient, intimidate, and erode self-identity. She understood that fear alone could be cruel, but structured fear, ritualized, calculated, unavoidable, was far more devastating. Generals who had commanded thousands found themselves trapped. In invisible labyrinths, their routines disrupted, their allies subtly replaced with observers whose eyes were always measuring their reactions. The rituals began with observation and isolation. Prisoners were often confined to chambers that seemed ordinary at first glance, yet nothing was as it appeared. Objects were rearranged, light shifted unexpectedly, whispers carried messages that could only be half understood. Every repetition, every small adjustment, reinforced the sense that control had been lost. Even the noblest leaders, trained to calculate and predict outcomes, could not map the rules of this new invisible dominion. The Lady of Death became both judge and oracle, her presence never overt, yet felt with unnerving precision. Next came symbolic actions, seemingly benign but psychologically devastating. The placement of food, the timing of messages, and even the rhythm of footsteps outside the chamber were orchestrated to make prisoners question reality itself. Allies were subtly replaced with actors, guards with silent observers. Each movement, each gesture, was loaded with hidden meaning, designed to remind captives that their world was no longer theirs. Pride, honor, and belief in strategy, the foundations of command, crumbled under the pressure of meticulously structured uncertainty. And then there were the whispers, private knowledge, half-truths, and confessions manipulated to test loyalty and resilience. She knew what each noble feared most: betrayal, shame, exposure, or failure. Words, carefully chosen and delivered at the right moment, created internal storms more violent than any physical assault. Some captives confessed to sins they had never committed. Others doubted every decision they had ever made. Even the most disciplined generals, who had faced battlefield chaos with unwavering composure, were reduced to trembling fragments of their former selves. This was not torture in the traditional sense. It was far more sophisticated. It was a methodical dismantling of the human psyche, leaving prisoners compliant, broken, and perpetually haunted. What made these rituals legendary was the subtlety. No chains, no blood, no visible weapons. Only the mind, manipulated with precision, became the battlefield. Entire political alliances shifted because of the decisions made under her influence. No prisoner emerged unchanged. The empire learned to wield her methods as quietly as any army, proving that true power often operates in the spaces between what is seen and what is felt. If this account already unsettles you, I want to know your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you would do if you were one of those prisoners facing a woman who could unravel your mind without touching you. Your insight shapes the way we explore these forgotten chapters of history. And as we continue, the next revelations will plunge even deeper into the shadows of her influence, revealing how far her control extended and how even the strongest could be manipulated beyond recognition. The Lady of Death was more than a captor. She was a strategist whose influence reached far beyond the walls of dungeons and chambers. Every act of psychological terror was part of a deliberate framework, a calculated tool to shape the choices of rulers, generals, and nobles alike. By destabilizing high-value prisoners, she forced entire councils to act in ways they otherwise would not. Battles were won before armies even clashed because the minds of key decision-makers had been dismantled and alliances shifted under invisible pressure. Fear became currency, and she controlled the market. Her interventions often coincided with crucial moments: the signing of a treaty, the preparation of a campaign, or the assembly of armies. A general who had been confident in strategy might suddenly overestimate enemy strength, delay movements, or betray a plan, all because of the subtle psychological manipulations she orchestrated in advance. Her presence, though rarely direct, was anticipated, and anticipation became a weapon of unparalleled precision. Commanders who once relied on intelligence and experience found themselves questioning every assumption, second-guessing their own instincts, and inadvertently playing into the empire's designs. It was not only about fear, it was about leveraging perception. Rumors of her methods were allowed to spread, reaching courts and fortresses far from her immediate control. Kings debated options not because they faced actual threats, but because the very possibility of encountering her unmade their confidence. Her reputation acted as a form of proxy power. A single whispered story could halt invasions, dissolve rebellions, or redirect the course of diplomacy. Entire armies hesitated, not because of the Lady of Death's physical presence, but because of the uncertainty she engineered, turning psychological instability into a decisive element of statecraft. She also understood the importance of timing. She never struck too early, never revealed all at once, and never relied on brutality alone. Instead, her interventions were incremental, precise, and carefully calibrated. By the time a prisoner fully realized the depth of her control, the damage was complete. The prisoner's decisions, now colored by fear, guilt, and confusion, influenced their correspondents, their generals, and their sovereigns. The ripple effect of her methods extended across entire kingdoms, often more effective than any siege or military campaign could be. Her cruelty was not chaotic. It was intelligence in action, applied with surgical precision. High-value prisoners, by their very nature, carried influence. To reshape empires, she did not need to annihilate armies. She only needed to disrupt thought. Generals who once dictated strategy became instruments of hesitation. Advisors who had swayed kings for decades became unpredictable, wavering in judgment. Entire political negotiations were rewritten without a single sword drawn. Empires responded to the Lady of Death not because of what she physically commanded, but because she had mastered the battlefield of the mind. Through her work, the empire discovered a terrifying truth. Psychological dominance could outperform physical conquest. Leaders, once confident in their authority, became pawns without realizing it. A single subtle action could alter the course of war, shift loyalties, and decide the fate of nations. And as these calculated manipulations accumulated, the Lady of Death's silent control became a force more decisive than any army marching under banners and drums, proving that true power often hides in the unseen, in the mind, and in the terror that comes before any blade is ever raised. Beyond the public halls of power and the visible chains of captivity, the Lady of Death maintained spaces that defied comprehension. Her secret prisons were not mere dungeons. They were meticulously constructed, theaters of psychological warfare, where every corridor, every cell, and every shadow was designed to manipulate perception. Light was scarce, yet it shifted unpredictably. Sounds echoed unnaturally, creating illusions of presence or absence. Prisoners quickly realized that walls were not merely barriers, but instruments, and silence itself was a tool she wielded with precision. In these chambers, the Lady of Death orchestrated an environment where control was both omnipresent and invisible. The routine of confinement was fragmented. Meals, messages, and interactions arrived at inconsistent times. Prisoners could not rely on any schedule, and gradually, instinct became unreliable. Trust, once a natural human resource, was extinguished. The very structure of thought, expectation, and hope was recalibrated against them. Every attempt to assert control or communicate was met with subtle distortions, causing uncertainty to replace certainty and doubt to replace confidence. Isolation was a cornerstone of her methodology. High-value prisoners, accustomed to influence and negotiation, found themselves alone with their thoughts, subjected to hours, sometimes days, without human interaction. When contact occurred, it was calculated to destabilize. Guards might ask questions that probed guilt or loyalty, then disappear without explanation. Fellow captives could be placed to deceive, offering false counsel or misleading gestures. Each element was designed to break habitual responses, forcing prisoners into a state of constant cognitive strain, where each decision became a risk of psychological collapse. Manipulation extended to sensory perception. Prisoners were made to question the accuracy of what they saw, heard, or remembered. Objects might appear altered. Letters arrived with false details. Footsteps resonated unnaturally, and shadows seemed to move with intent. The Lady of Death understood that control over perception could dominate more completely than physical. Chains. By twisting reality in subtle, relentless ways, she dismantled the foundational certainties that prisoners relied upon: identity, judgment, and moral confidence. Those who once commanded armies were reduced to vulnerable, hesitant individuals, each step and thought carefully orchestrated. Communication, when permitted, was rarely direct. A single phrase, cryptic yet personalized, could undo months of experience and authority. Prisoners were forced to confront truths they could not accept, secrets they never intended to reveal, and fears they had long suppressed. Some capitulated, others resisted, but in ways that left them irrevocably changed. Over time, even the most resilient minds exhibited signs of fracturing. Political judgment faltered, strategy wavered, and alliances destabilized before any army had marched. The Lady of Death's secret prison proved that the most effective conquest often occurred without swords, sieges, or open battle. By controlling perception, isolating influence, and manipulating cognition, she transformed prisoners into instruments whose every choice reverberated across kingdoms. Her methods blurred the lines between captivity and strategic theater, leaving those who survived profoundly altered, incapable of returning to the positions of authority they once held. And yet, despite the psychological devastation she wrought, Few outside her inner circle understood the full extent of her control. An empire influenced as much by the fear she instilled as by armies or laws. Not all records of the Lady of Death's actions were erased. Some survived, hidden in letters, marginal notes, and accounts that risked being burned or dismissed as superstition. These fragments tell stories that official chronicles intentionally omitted, revealing the true scope of her influence over high-value prisoners. Noblemen who returned to their courts could barely speak, haunted by memories they had no words for. Advisors documented events in private journals, but most of these were censored, destroyed, or concealed by fear of retribution. What remained were whispers, partial testimonies that hinted at her unparalleled mastery of psychological control. One letter, smuggled from a fortress in the Northern Territories, described a general who had been captured after a decisive battle. He was considered unbreakable, seasoned by decades of warfare and political maneuvering. Yet after days under her observation, he became compliant, revealing strategic secrets he had vowed never to divulge. The document hinted that he had been subjected not to threats of execution, but to subtle, almost imperceptible manipulations. Letters arrived with ambiguous content. Fellow captives were repositioned to create doubt, and carefully staged encounters forced him to confront the consequences of past decisions in ways that blurred reality. By the time he returned, his authority was diminished, his reputation silently undermined. Another account, found in the margin of a royal ledger, described a noblewoman confined for months after challenging the empire's decrees. Her diary recounted sequences of events that were barely believable, shadows appearing at impossible angles, messages contradicting themselves, and whispers that carried truths only she could comprehend. The psychological strain was so severe that she began to question her own memory. By the time she was released, she avoided politics entirely, her influence quietly extinguished without any overt execution. The Lady of Death had weaponized fear in a manner more effective than any battlefield, leaving no bodies behind but reshaping the decisions and loyalties of entire regions. These testimonies, though incomplete, reveal a pattern. She never acted impulsively, never wasted effort. Every action was calculated, aimed at producing maximum disruption with minimal physical intervention. Prisoners returned to power, if they returned at all, bearing invisible scars that influenced policy, diplomacy, and war. Even rulers who had initially dismissed the accounts came to recognize a chilling truth. The Lady of Death's power extended far beyond her immediate presence. An empire could be reshaped by her influence long before any armies clashed or treaties were signed. The surviving testimonies also illustrate the sheer terror she inspired. Prisoners who resisted initially would often comply voluntarily after experiencing subtle manipulations that left them uncertain of what was real. Allies became suspects, loyalty became suspect, even memory was suspect. By systematically dismantling their trust in themselves and others, she created a form of domination that was impossible to counter with conventional measures. The empire had crafted a weapon whose reach was both silent and pervasive, and whose victims rarely understood the mechanics of their own subjugation. If these accounts already make you question the limits of human control and the shadows of forgotten history, I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if confronted by someone who could dismantle your mind without raising a sword? Your reflections are essential to exploring these hidden truths. And as we move forward, what comes next will reveal even more about how the Lady of Death reshaped the fate of entire kingdoms and the invisible rules of power that governed medieval empires. The reach of the Lady of Death extended far beyond the D-Day confines of dungeons and secret chambers. Her influence was felt in the councils of kings, the planning rooms of generals, and the negotiation tables where treaties were drawn. Battles were not merely fought on open fields. They were shaped in the shadows, where her presence, often unseen, had already begun to alter the psychology of those who held command. Armies marched with hesitation, strategies faltered, and alliances shifted, all because of the invisible hand of a woman who understood that fear and uncertainty could be more decisive than steel and arrows. Generals who once relied on strict chains of command and disciplined tactics found themselves second-guessing every order. Ambassadors approached negotiations with an unspoken dread, unsure whether the information they conveyed would be manipulated, misinterpreted, or weaponized. Even kings, the ultimate arbiters of authority, began to act defensively, adjusting campaigns not according to intelligence reports, but in anticipation of what the Lady of Death might have orchestrated behind the scenes. Her methods transformed prisoners into instruments of indirect control, turning the human psyche itself into a battlefield where every decision carried hidden consequences. Reports indicate that entire campaigns were postponed or rerouted because her subtle interventions destabilized key figures. A trusted general might delay a march, not because of enemy movements, but because he doubted his own memory, questioned the loyalty of his lieutenants, or feared traps meticulously implied by manipulated information. Treaties were renegotiated under pressure that was invisible, yet undeniable. Princes and rulers, aware of her presence in some capacity, shifted their allegiances preemptively, fearful that even minor defiance could unravel their own positions. Her mastery of influence ensured that her empire's political and military objectives were achieved without direct confrontation, proving that manipulation could be as effective as any siege. Moreover, her strategies created cascading effects. A single high-value prisoner, reshaped by her psychological interventions, could return to their realm and inadvertently alter entire campaigns. They carried with them subtle fears, doubts, and hesitations implanted during confinement. Decisions previously made with confidence now hesitated at crucial moments, turning the tide of battles and influencing diplomatic outcomes. Entire kingdoms felt the consequences, not through direct action by armies, but through the ripples of fear and uncertainty she had sown. The Lady of Death also cultivated an aura that magnified her influence. Rumors traveled faster than armies. Whispers of her capabilities reached distant courts and fortresses, often before she arrived in person. Leaders adapted their behavior preemptively, aware that their choices would be scrutinized, manipulated, and exploited. Even those who had never seen her knew that her presence, or even the mere suggestion of it, was sufficient to change the course of decisions, to bend strategies, and to redirect the flow of power. Her name alone became a tool, a psychological weapon that destabilized confidence and imposed obedience without lifting a hand. Through this invisible command, she demonstrated the profound truth that wars are not only won by strength and numbers, but by control of perception, manipulation of will, and mastery over fear. By the time armies clashed and treaties were signed, her influence had already rewritten the expectations, intentions, and fears of those in command. Her victims, whether prisoners or rulers, moved through the chessboard of power according to the rules she set silently, demonstrating that true domination often operates in the spaces no one sees, where psychology eclipses brute force, and where an empire's fate can hinge on the mind of a single, unseen figure. Despite the aura of inevitability surrounding her influence, the Lady of Death was not invincible. There were those who underestimated her, who believed that a single blade, a well-timed ambush, or betrayal from within her own network could end her reign of psychological mastery. Yet every attempt failed, not because of luck, but because she anticipated, adapted, and transformed threats into instruments of further control. Those who tried to remove her found themselves ensnared in the very traps they had designed, demonstrating that her power was as much about foresight and manipulation as it was about fear. In one recorded attempt, a coalition of nobles sought to capture her during a transfer of prisoners. They believed the route was secure, that the escort would remain predictable. What they did not realize was that the Lady of Death had anticipated deviations, analyzed every potential betrayal, and subtly reshaped the environment. When the nobles approached, the prisoners themselves, already conditioned by her earlier interventions, misled the attackers, delaying them until the escape was complete. The would-be captors returned humiliated, their failure reinforcing her legend, instilling the notion that her presence alone could destabilize even the most coordinated operations. Rumors of her invincibility spread quickly. Commanders and diplomats alike learned to treat her as a force that could influence outcomes without physical engagement. Generals planning campaigns against the empire found that preemptive actions often backfired, because any disruption she anticipated would amplify confusion and uncertainty. Her survival against assassination attempts became a symbol, a psychological weapon that eclipsed her immediate actions. By simply existing, she was able to unsettle, delay, and manipulate decisions, making her presence a strategic factor on par with any army or fortress. Her failures, when they occurred, were instructive rather than destructive. Each attempt on her life became a case study in miscalculation and overconfidence. Those who underestimated the subtleties of her methods rarely survived the political and psychological consequences. Prisoners and allies alike observed that even when she appeared vulnerable, her mastery of influence ensured that she turned situations to her advantage, creating fear and uncertainty long after the immediate threat had passed. In this way, she transformed danger into an extension of her control, proving that survival itself could be a tool for dominance. Kings and generals soon recognized a harsh truth. Her presence in a campaign, a prison, or even a council chamber was considered a harbinger of defeat. Plans adjusted to account for her influence, allies hesitated, and enemies second-guessed every maneuver. Empires that failed to acknowledge her impact found their strategies unraveling, their prisoners compromised, and their resources wasted. She became, in essence, an invisible general commanding a battlefield no one could see, whose mere presence shifted the odds, without a single sword being drawn. By the end of these chronicles, it was evident that the Lady of Death's influence extended far beyond her physical interactions. Her survival against attempts on her life was not simply proof of resilience, it was evidence of a deeper mastery of human perception, control, and psychological warfare. Her legend grew, echoing across kingdoms, reminding rulers and prisoners alike that power often resides not in armies or weapons, but in the mind, and that those who could manipulate fear with precision often determined the fates of entire realms before battle was ever joined. The Lady of Death vanished from history in the official records, yet her influence persisted in ways that rulers and prisoners alike could not anticipate. Her techniques, precision in manipulation, psychological orchestration, and subtle control, did not disappear with her final recorded act. They became embedded in the way empires governed, in the covert mechanisms of influence, and in the quiet enforcement of compliance across realms. To understand her legacy is to recognize that power often operates through fear and uncertainty, rather than swords and siege engines. Kings, generals, and bureaucrats continued to wield the principles she perfected, consciously or unconsciously, shaping decisions in ways that seemed invisible yet were devastatingly effective. Her methods became a template: isolate the mind, control perception, manipulate anticipation, and ensure that every decision, no matter how trivial, is influenced by doubt. In courtly chambers and war rooms, advisors began to emulate her subtle strategies, conditioning loyalty, shaping alliances, and ensuring obedience without overt force. Even centuries later, Historians can trace patterns of psychological dominance in military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations that echo the same techniques the Lady of Death had perfected. Fear, carefully applied, can alter the course of kingdoms just as effectively as cannon fire or mounted cavalry. Her invisible hand moved silently, yet it touched the outcomes of entire battles, the fates of dynasties, and the choices of rulers who believed themselves in control. Some of her surviving prisoners, the few whose testimonies endured, became unintentional carriers of her legacy. They returned to their territories profoundly changed, influencing political and military decisions with caution, hesitation, and a heightened awareness of manipulation. The knowledge they carried, whispered in private councils, reshaped allegiances and recalibrated strategies. Her mastery was not simply in breaking individuals, it was in altering the frameworks within which nations operated. Those who underestimated her learned that power was not solely invisible authority. It was in shaping minds, expectations, and the perception of inevitability. And now, after centuries, her story comes to you, echoing through time not as myth, but as evidence that the shadows of influence often outlast armies and empires. The Lady of Death demonstrated that one individual, armed with understanding, subtlety, and precision, could reshape entire structures of power without wielding conventional force. The principles she applied are recognizable in modern political strategy, psychological warfare, and even corporate manipulation, a testament to how human nature and fear continue to govern decisions long after swords have rusted and crowns have faded. If you've followed this journey to its end, take a moment to reflect. Have you considered how unseen influence might have shaped events around you? Leave a comment saying something like, "I stayed to the end," or "This story was for me," to show you've witnessed the full scope of her shadow. Make sure to hit like if the narrative compelled you, and check that you're subscribed. This channel uncovers the hidden forces that history forgot, the strategies that rulers never recorded, and the individuals who reshaped worlds quietly yet irrevocably. There is more waiting just beyond this story. Another chapter, another figure, another hidden truth. There's a video here that complements what you've seen. Click and continue exploring, because the shadows of history stretch farther than most realize, and the lessons the past left behind are still alive, waiting for those willing to observe, learn, and remember.